Good morning,
Morning, John.
and welcome to the start of the spring semester of Learning and Retirement. I'd like to see every phone lifted and turned off. Someone just said no. All right. Bill Burrow just said if anyone would like a copy of what's at your seat and you don't have one or can't get your hands on one, when you leave, someone will be at the door and they'll make a copy for you. So just let them know. Before we start, I'd like us to have just a moment of silence because this is the Martin Luther King Day. And so let's just close our eyes or look up or whatever you want to do. And we'll just for a little bit, we'll be quiet. Okay. Our speaker this morning is Dr. Clark Ross. He is the Francis W. Johnson Professor of Economics Emeritus at Davidson College and served as Vice President for Academic Affairs and Dean of the Faculty from 1998 to 2013. He reminded me this morning of something that I forgot. He came from Ann Arbor in 1979, and guess what was on his moving van? All the Griffith stuff coming from Ann Arbor to Davidson. So we've known him for a good long time. He is the author of many articles associated with the James G. Martin Center for Academic Renewal and has established and led numerous initiatives to advance students in the academy. He retired this past year. Clark received his BA from the University of Pennsylvania and his PhD from Boston College, a Jesuit university. He provided a significant endowment to the college, Davidson College, to support Catholic students with demonstrated financial need. It's interesting that Catholic students now represent the single largest religious group at the college at 18%. All would say he is one of Davidson's most beloved faculty members, particularly by students.
Good job.
Please welcome Ross to Learning and Retirement. Ross.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. It's a bit of a challenge to speak about Donald Trump and economics. And I sort of tried to prepare a little bit of a introduction here on my cell phone to give you at least an indication of why I can't give you absolutely unambiguous and correct presumptions. First off, we have various issues that Trump has spoken about, everything from tariffs to deportation, et cetera. And I'm going to try to make some mention of each. Each of them have different variants. He's said different things about each. So if you look at the sort of permutations of combinations of issues and variants, it's pretty impressive, if you call it impressive. So the effects are, to begin with, quite unclear. Trump also is not alone in determining what happens. The Federal Reserve is very instrumental, as you know, with respect to interest rates and economic activity. That's partially why, or it's principally why, as you know, Trump has been both critical of them and desirous of a greater control over the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is technically independent by its establishment in 1913, and he's not able to control it. And in fact, The current chair, Powell, has indicated he will not resign even if asked by Trump. The irony, which is, of course, long forgotten, is that Trump is the one who appointed Powell to that position. And ironically, President Biden reappointed Powell. So it's a little bit unclear, if you're not happy with Powell, sort of whom to blame about all this. Nevertheless, the greatest, I think, indication of how the economy is doing, and if you like, how Trump may be doing, will be markets, because markets can't really be controlled and dictated by the president or any one person. So we have the stock market, we have the bond market, and we have mortgage rates as three very critical things to think about and look at over the next few years. Since Trump's been elected, all three of them have had probably some degree of increased volatility. There isn't any unambiguous trend that has come with all three of them. That's also because the Federal Reserve has been suggesting that it is nervous about Trump and nervous about deficits and possibly nervous about further lowering interest rates. So it really is a fairly complicated thing. Now, the recent edition of The Economist had a very a good introduction to Trump and his economic policy by essentially saying that they viewed him as having three types of advisors: conservative mainstream economists, and those would be individuals who, have a PhD in economics and or some other sophisticated professional economic training, but are conservative. So conservative mainstream economists. The American first type, and that's the, make America great again. That's the sort of traditional, candidly less educated Trumpite. That would be the second. And then the third is his recent interest in things like technology and the role that technology can play. And Elon Musk is a good example of that. So, whether we like it or not, Trump is a bit better organized on the economic front this time than he was in 2017. He seems to have, and I'm going to talk about the advisors, fairly well placed individuals based on his preferences. This is unlike what you've seen with the Justice Department, the FBI, Department of Defense, where things are much more hectic. There seems to have been a fairly concerted effort by Trump in designating people in economics. And if you look at the first part of this handout I gave you, where it says key economic advisors, I don't know these people very well. I don't know any of them personally, but I don't even know that much about them. Stephen Marin, though, is the chair of the Economic Advisors Designate, which is a position that does need to be approved. He's been a senior advisor in the Treasury Department during the first Trump term. He has an economics PhD from Harvard. He's a hedge fund strategist. He's been somewhat of a critic of the Federal Reserve. And he's been particularly concerned with the inflation that Biden and the Federal Reserve, in his mind, have tolerated. He's conservative, but he's not upsetting to mainstream economists. He supports some use of tariffs, but is not a major, proponent of tariffs saving everything. The second person is the one that is more of concern to most economists, and that is Peter Navarro. You've all heard of him. He's a political and economic advisor. He does not have, please note, He does not have a specific position that requires congressional approval. He is the Make America Great solace. As you know, he criticized the election results. He's been a strong defender of tariffs. He even went to prison. He is not at all well respected by economists, but Trump does, in fact, have him representing that particular group that he owes so many votes to, the middle great, Make America Great group. Scott Bessent is designated as the Secretary of the Treasury. He was a great relief in many ways to CEOs and financial markets. He's a free market conservative, but he is a very successful hedge fund manager, very smart. He's reasonably cautious both with debt and inflation. He has a BA from Yale. He supported Al Gore at one point. He has taught economic history at Yale. And his post, of course, requires congressional approval, which is very, very likely. There is a great feeling that he will try to better manage the debt and the deficits. His record on Wall Street is fairly unambiguous in terms of making billions of dollars with the different hedge funds that he's been involved in. All of it perfectly ethically and just by virtue of being intelligent. He is a non-ideological, which, as I said, is a relief to many. He's been a very strong supporter of Yale, both with their alumni. He's also for a major cabinet position, and here I'm talking about Treasury or Secretary of State or Attorney General, the first openly gay individual. So again, there was quite a bit of relief when Trump announced him, and quite frankly, some degree of surprise by many people, because he doesn't strike you as a great Make America Great Again crowd. The same, or a little bit less so, can be said about Kevin Hassett, who will be the director of the White House National Economic Council. Now, I was trying to look carefully at the difference between the Council of Economic Advisors and the White House National Economic Council, for fear that somebody might ask me, as well as to be able to explain it to you. The chair of the Council of Economic Advisors has been a position that's existed since the 1940s with the Full Employment Act. And this individual is responsible for providing accurate and timely macroeconomic policy data for those active in economics in the country. It basically is more of a provider of existing data. And in contrast, the National Economic Council at the White House provides more advice to the president and is more controversial. Scott Hassett is going to have that position. He also is less protectionist than some. He is more in favor of the use of tariffs as a strategic threat for persuasion. And I'm going to talk about that at some point today, what is meant by that. He also is a fairly conventional economic professor, PhD, I believe, from Columbia. He advised Mitt Romney. And as I said, the National Economic Council provides more counsel to the president than the CEA, Council of Economic Advisors. Finally, we have Elon Musk, and it's very unclear what his role will be. He's very big on efficiency, on technology, and there's some suggestion that he will be trying to streamline the government. And there's some fear about his streamlining the government. One of the reasons of his streamlining the government is not only the appeal to the Make America Great crowd, but to try to reduce the deficit, to try to reduce government spending. And I'll make some mention of that. But he is part of this technology crowd. So if you look at the three groups I talked about, more conventional economists, you have Moran, you have Besant, and you have Hassett. If you look at the Make America Great crowd, you have our Peter Navarro, who really doesn't have a full position. And finally, on the technology side, you have Musk, who has the aid of Vivek Ramaswamy, who I don't know too much about either. Now, let's move on to the particular issues that these groups are going to have to address. There's the budget deficit and debt, there's tariffs, there's deportation, and there are others like the national health care technology. I'd like us to talk about particularly the first three and mention the fourth. But the government debt and deficit is a serious concern. It's more serious now than in 2017 because the deficit is greater now, and our debt is much greater, much, much greater than in 2017 when Trump inherited the office from President Obama. We also have less room for the economy to grow. The economy, as you know, is operating at a low rate of unemployment. And in fact, the Federal Reserve is trying to slow the economy down. The impact of that on the deficit is that in 2017, there was room for the economy to grow, which would generate more income tax revenues and reduce the pressure on the deficit. So it's very hard to figure out how Trump can improve the deficit situation. And that's part of why he has someone like a Scott Bessent as the Secretary of the Treasury, who hopefully can do that in a way that's consistent with Trump's overall views. But right now, if we look, the federal deficit, if you go to the next page there, is about $1.8 trillion, which is 6.2% of our GDP. And that is a very, very high rate. Our GDP is 29 trillion, and 6.2% of that is about $1.8 trillion. By historic standards, that is hugely high. Even during certain wars, it barely exceeded that. Now, Bessent wishes to lower it to 3% over a few years, and that would mean about 600 to 700 trillion. And that's going to be very difficult because with any tax cuts, and Trump has talked about continuing tax cuts for the wealthy. So with any tax cuts, he's also talked about introducing a lower rate of taxation on capital gains and any deportation costs. We'll talk about that. The deportation costs can be very high. It's very difficult to see how the deficit can be reduced towards 3%. And I say needs miraculously selected tariffs. And in some sense, I almost shouldn't have put that there, but it gives the impression that tariffs might be able to do it because tariffs really can't. Now, the problem with this deficit is that we have interest payments now of about 892 billion because the interest payments are on the whole debt. And our whole debt, if you go back somewhere up there, I had it, was about $36 trillion. So the federal debt, $36 trillion, has annual interest of about 2.5%, and that is $892 billion. That is about 13% of total federal spending. It's now only behind Social Security and Medicare and is basically the same as national defense. The concern with this is that it's liable to get greater because if we have more deficit, we have more debt, but we also are expecting to have higher interest rates. 2.5% represents some interest on debt that was incurred 10 years ago when interest rates were 1.5%, 2%. Now you cannot borrow money. The federal government cannot borrow money at that. The 10-year interest rate for government bonds now is about 4.6%. And so if you start renewing this deficit that was at 2% at 4.6%, you're going to be raising further the interest payments, even if the amount of debt doesn't change. Why is this upsetting? Well, it's upsetting for two reasons. One, as interest rates go up, it does what economists call crowd out private investment. Businesses borrow less when interest rates are 5% than when they're 2%. Individual households borrow less when interest rates are 5%. They don't borrow as much for automobiles and for housing. So we have a fear of crowding out. The other concern we have, which is particularly true, I say, for our younger people, and I tried to talk to the college students about it when I was at Davidson, even though, unfortunately, I don't think they took it as seriously as I think they should, is the fact that as interest payments become a greater portion of total federal spending, 13% now, but as they go up to 15, 20%, what does that mean for them? It basically means that the U.S. government can do less unless it further raises taxes. And that means things like education, the environment, possibly national defense. All of those get squeezed in the future because the government legally must pay this interest. And as I say, today, at 13% of federal spending, it's already becoming onerous, and it's going nowhere but up. The irony is the Make America Great crowd doesn't talk so much about that part of the deficit and those implications of the deficit as they talk about to whom it's owed, to whom the debt is owed, which is, to the Chinese, and to some extent other Asian countries. For economists, that is totally irrelevant because it's a debt that must legally be paid, whether it's owed to me or to you in a pension fund or to the Japanese government or the Chinese government. And it's just ridiculous to have, in some sense, diverted the issue to the ownership of the debt as opposed to the impact of debt, regardless of who owns it. About 35% of that debt is owned by international entities. They have, as you know, surpluses with us, particularly the Chinese. And as they export to us more than they import from us, they earn funds, which they, instead of converting to other uses, have actually used to lend to the United States. That's part of why we were able to borrow money at such low interest rates, was that international entities were loaning us so much money. So if there's a fault with all the dealings with the international crowd, it's the fact that their willingness to loan us money kept interest rates low, which encouraged us to borrow more money. That is no longer as true now as global interest rates have gone up, as all the central banks have tried to tighten money. So we're going to have what I told you earlier is the main problem with the debt and deficit, higher interest rates, and likely a greater amount of debt, which means more debt servicing. Now, is it possible for the interest rate, for the um, amount of deficit to go down under Trump? And it's unclear how that is going to be the case. I said there's upward pressure on because of tax cuts and interest rates, because as we cut taxes and have to borrow money, interest rates go up. The Federal Reserve has been trying to slow interest rate increases. But remember, the Federal Reserve influences interest rates. They don't set them or control them. And in fact, even though they have cut interest rates twice in the last, 8 months, 6 months, the 10-year bond rate has actually gone up some, mainly because there is fear that under Trump, we are going to have higher deficits and we're going to have higher interest payments. So this is why the market is somewhat sending volatile signals about what they expect out of Trump. Now, another possibility here is Elon Musk and whether his Department of Government Efficiency, as it's supposedly going to be called, can truly bring down government costs. And it's unclear that that's the case. We'll see that tariffs can raise revenues, but really just modestly. The fact that to expect that tariffs can address the deficit is just not possible. We also have his claim about deportation, and we don't know what effect that is going to have on wages and inflation. And we don't know what effect the cost of that will be. Now, one thing we do have here is Trump's obsession with the stock markets. As all of you may remember, he was constantly talking about how well the stock market did during his first 4 years. For the stock market to do well, the deficit has to be somewhat under control and interest rates have to be kept modest. And so that is going to be a monitor on him. And again, that one, the stock market has been volatile since his election. At first, it went up. Then, as the Federal Reserve started expressing concern about deficits and higher interest rates, it went down. Now it's gone up again last week. But it's unclear. Since Biden has been president, he hasn't talked about the stock market, which, is appropriate in some sense. But as of today, the behavior of the stock market more becomes somewhat tied to him. And it's going to be interesting to see. Because as I said, markets are something he can't literally control. And the markets give us some degree of sense as to how the financial world is viewing the economy and what's going to happen. And if you look at predictions from most of the stock market, pundits, and I'm talking about important people like at Wells or BlackRock, it's unclear. Nobody is prepared to go out on a limb and say markets should go up or markets should go down. And that's going to be interesting. Now let's move on to tariffs. The objectives of tariffs are or can be viewed as threefold. One is revenue raising. The second is protection of domestic industry and trying to limit imports to encourage domestic industry. Those two objectives for tariffs have been foremost discussed in the United States since 1789. And in fact, the first piece of legislation passed by the George Washington administration was the Tariff Act of 1789. And Sally's there looking and smiling that I remember that. But Alexander Hamilton, as you know, was very big on promoting tariffs, not only for the revenue to pay for the government, but for the protection. Thomas Jefferson, as you know, was negative on tariffs. But we have discussed revenue and protection effects of tariffs since 1789. They became very, very vital in the 1820s and 1830s when we had the tariff of abominations. We had nullification in South Carolina. Tariffs as an issue basically ended in a certain way in 1860, 1861, because with the Confederates out of the Congress, tariffs were raised dramatically in the United States by Republican presidents as a way of paying for the war and for protection. And we had high tariffs from basically 1861 to 1913. And in 1913, we had the Wilson, the Underwood-Simmons tariff reduction, but that was less critical because by 1913, the 16th Amendment to the Constitution had been approved, and we introduced the federal income tax. And the federal income tax then became our primary way of raising revenues. What many of us don't realize is that tariffs were our principal source of revenue up until the income tax. The income tax was illegal under the Constitution because it was not basically based on appropriate apportionment. So it took an amendment, the 16th, to have the income tax. Thereafter, tariffs became less relevant. And after World War II, we went into a period of progressively lower tariffs as a way of trying to stimulate overall global growth and harmony. That's why in 2017, when Trump started pushing for higher tariffs, this was a huge surprise, particularly when it came from a Republican. And most economists were very negative because they did not want to see a reversal of the post-World War period of tariff reductions. Tariffs were reduced in the U.S. to an average about 2%, which was very, very low. Now, I said there were three possible objectives to tariffs: revenue raising and protection, which the United States used very effectively until 1913. Our protection was very effective also in the post-Civil War period, which is why we had such industrial growth. Trump has introduced a third use of tariffs. You know how he talks about tariff as such a beautiful word? Well, it's because it can raise revenue, it can introduce protection, but he's also talking about using it for political pressure and threats, which we have not really, as a government, done very much. He's already talked to Mexico and Canada about doing some reductions of some imports. Otherwise, he will threaten them with 20% tariffs. This is very much of the Make America Great philosophy. Use our power, and in this case, it's not military power, but economic power through tariffs. And this is something that is not common to our history, really. And it's in some ways fairly upsetting. But it's clear that he intends to use that when possible. It also gives him the excuse of not raising tariffs across the board if he can successfully use it in some key cases. Now, again, I'm not saying that's a good idea, but it would lower the probability of raising tariffs across the board. Because remember, he's talked about 20% increases for tariffs for all countries and 60% for China. Nevertheless, we have had fairly significant, some degree of significant tariffs against China since Trump was in office the first time. And ironically, Biden did not eliminate those tariffs. He kept them. They mostly were on automobiles from China and solar panels. Yet China has the largest trade surplus of any country in the world. So despite our imposing tariffs on China, they continue to export far more than they import. And they had $1 trillion surplus last year, which, even adjusted for inflation, is the largest surplus by any one country in the world. The United States had previously had the largest trade surplus adjusted for prices in 1946, as we exported many items to countries that could not produce themselves coming out of World War II. If you're wondering why China's economic situation is somewhat critical, even though they're exporting so much, i.e., manufacturing so much, a lot of it has to do with property issues. They overbuilt dramatically with property, and they find themselves with recurring real estate debts that are problematic, that really have nothing to do internationally, but are a concern. Now, what we have to realize is that the burden from tariffs is highly misunderstood or not clear. Tariffs can be considered like the gas tax. The federal government imposes a gas tax of about $1.50 a gallon. Now, who pays that? Well, you might say the seller turns that money over to the government, right? Do they pay the tax? No. You know that some of the tax is passed on to you as a consumer. Not all of it, but some of it. Tariffs and unit taxes like that have a burden that is shared. Now, I've tried to give you an example. Let's say that a 60% tariff is imposed on a product that free trade costs or sells for $10. 60% of that is $6. So for every unit sold in the United States takes in $6. That's the equivalent of the $1.50 federal gas tax. But who pays it? Well, let's say it's divided between the producer in China and the consumer in the United States. If 70% of it falls on the consumer, that would be 70% of $6 or $4.20. And so the consumer will now pay $10 plus $4.20 or $14.20. The U.S. consumer will, in fact, pay a higher tax. That tariff will be inflationary. If the consumer is paying 70%, if you go to page 3 there, the producer is paying 30%, $6, which is $1.80. Their receipts go down because $1.80 goes to the government and not to them, goes to the U.S. government. They only receive $8.20. Now, economists talk about a wedge being driven between the producer price and the consumer price. The producer price is $8.20. The consumer price that we just did was what, $14.20. So there's a wedge. Now, it's possible that 100% of the burden is on the consumer. In that case, the $6 would fall totally on the consumer, and the price would go up to $16. It's possible that 100% of the burden is on the producer, in which case the price would go down to the producer to $4, and the consumer would have no effect. It's basically, and this is what gets very complicated in economics, it's basically the elasticities of demand and supply that determine how much of the tax is passed on to the consumer. The demand for gasoline is fairly inelastic, meaning that we buy much the same amount regardless of price. For that reason, the tax gets very much passed on to consumers. Now, China is a sole producer of certain goods that we're buying. And as a result, they are offering those to us at the best price they can get. And that means they bear a fair bit of the burden. They bear a fair bit of the burden of the tariff. Not all of it, but a fair bit. So when Trump talks about China paying the tax, he's not totally off the mark. China does pay, as part of the burden, a fair bit of the tariff. But the United States will pay some. Our consumers will pay some. You know, we don't hear consumers crying about the tariff on Chinese automobiles because that burden is not greatly imposed on us. But nevertheless, tariffs can be inflationary. They're not deflationary because even if no burden is paid by America, the price stays the same. Regardless of who pays the burden, however, the revenues still come to the United States. The $6 still comes to the United States. So, you know, there is some, you know, reason to discuss tariffs, and I'll come to that in a second. But tariff revenues, as I've written here, are low compared to deficit and debt. Tariff revenues in 2016, during the last year of President Obama, was $34.8 billion. They have gone up by almost a factor of 3 to $100 billion because Trump raised tariffs and Biden kept them. So there is a fair increase. But remember, the deficit is 1.8 trillion. It's much larger than current tariff revenues. And even if you double tariff revenues to, you know, 200 billion, it would be well short of that deficit. So it's highly unlikely that we're going to see tariffs as a way of eliminating the deficit. And there is likely to be some inflationary impact. Now, Moran at the Council of Economic Advisors does favor tariffs going up towards 20%. As a way of weakening the dollar. The dollar will be weakened because if we impose tariffs, foreigners don't want to buy our goods and they don't need our money or need the dollar. The advantage of lowering the value of the dollar is that it will encourage the purchase of some other goods that aren't tariffed. So there is some value here in reducing the value of the dollar. But again, this gets all fairly complicated, and it's far more complicated than Trump can understand. But he does have some people with Bassett and Moran who can talk about it. And if you study economics, particularly at the graduate level, there actually is something called an optimum tariff. And that optimum tariff is not zero. It basically is a tariff that balances a negative impact on terms of trade because it makes imports more expensive, makes our imports more expensive, so we don't export as much to other countries. So that's a negative impact, even though we get tax revenue. But it does provide protection. And so there is something that is an optimum tariff. For small countries who can't influence prices, the optimum tariff is essentially zero. But for larger countries like China or the United States, you can calculate an optimum tariff. We have not done that over the years, mainly because we have, since World War II, taken the general policy that tariffs approaching zero for all countries are desirable to promote economic integration. So we have not talked about optimum tariffs, but it's going to be interesting because that probably will be talked about. And it is something that, has economic theory behind it. It is very uncertain, though, because it's based on the tariff rates that other countries have. So if they change their tariff rates, it changes the optimum. Finally, you should realize that the president can call for a national emergency as a way of changing tariffs without congressional approval. Now, I want to leave time for discussion here. I would like you to see that the deportation has a problem of 11 million people who are undocumented and the possibility of a direct cost, if you were to do it all at once, of 315 billion, which is 3 times the current deficit, remember? The other thing that is being talked about with deportation is what will be the effect on wages. And it's not clear that wages will all go up. There's generally a presumption that if you lower the supply of labor, wages will go up. But there is some suggestion that demand for American labor in some areas could fall because there are businesses that combine imported labor with American middle educated labor. And if you get rid of the labor that Americans don't want to do, the whole business falls, in which case you lose the demand for American labor. And so there are some ambiguities here. We also see here the conflict between Musk, who's talking about special talent visas and more imports, and the great, Make America Great crowd that doesn't want that. So it's going to be kind of interesting. It's kind of interesting. So as we look at things like inflation, growth of GDP, interest rates, and tariffs and trade, it's very uncertain where we're going to wind up. It really is very uncertain. And the fact that markets have been so volatile suggests that. So what I've tried to do is give you a little bit of a review of these issues so that you can look forward to seeing what happens and have hopefully a little more knowledge and understanding about them. But I don't have major predictions. John, should we take some questions?
Let's thank Clark for that excellent presentation. You know the rules. Raise your hand. Someone will come to you with a mic, state your question. He'll repeat the question and give an answer. All right, let's see what you want to find out.
Looking at deportation, I see prices are going to skyrocket on food because of labor market. There's a unseen thing in hospitals that they will lose a tremendous amount of, not nurses or doctors, but support people who are Hispanic or thing, will go, who's going to replace them? If you're going to replace them, they're going to cost more. I think deportation may be one of the biggest causes of a problem economically in the country.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. The cost of deportation, higher wages, reduced supplies of things like food are clear. And Trump made a big appeal about deportation to his Make America Great crowd. The traditional economists that I've talked about, both at the Council of Economic Advisors and certainly Bassett at Treasury, are not really going to favor massive deportations. I mean, I think you have to realize that what Trump says in a campaign is not necessarily what Trump is going to do as president. He will find some way of suggesting why he didn't do it. But I would not expect massive deportations. Just the cost of it is viewed as, I told you, 100,000 a person, because a lot of these people would have to have hearings. Some of them have the ability to contest their deportation. And unfortunately, a lot of people believe Trump on that. But I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I just don't think we're going to see it. It's just the same as the tariffs. I don't think we're going to see tariffs of 60% on Chinese goods and 20% on all other goods. The inflationary impact would just be too great.
Could you speak to the impact of Trump's embrace of cryptocurrency on the dollar and the debt?
I really can't. I honestly don't know too much about that. And I don't know. The question had to do with cryptocurrency and Trump's infatuation with it. I'm not really sure that there will be much of an impact. A lot of it will be dependent upon what Edmund Musk says about it and what Secretary of Treasury Bassett says about it. And I think that the uncertainty that it would introduce in financial markets is probably going to be very discouraging of that. But in all honesty, I don't know that much about it. I think Bassett has talked about it more almost as an investment, which in a way it is. It's an alternative way of holding wealth, and probably doesn't want to see it change from that. But that's not a very good answer for you, because I haven't seen any real precise comment on what he wants to do with cryptocurrency. There are some countries in which cryptocurrency is a legal substitute for payment, like I believe El Salvador. But we haven't had any discussion about that, so I don't think we will see that. But that's a good question and something we need to look towards, I think. The national emergency thing was in reference to tariffs. Missy asked about my commenting on national emergencies. We generally have learned ourselves in high school and college that tax increases need to start with the House of Representatives and move through the legislature and be approved by the executive branch. An exception to that is tariffs. The government does have, or the president does have the right to declare that a tariff is aimed at addressing a national emergency. Now, we have really not done that or used that. A very good question would be, if Trump tries to do it, what national emergency is he calling for? And that is unclear. But again, it becomes a little bit irrelevant because if a Republican Senate and House of Representatives supports him, then he's going to be able to do it. He's going to be able to do it. So the reason it comes up and is discussed is that at first some people were saying, well, we don't really need to worry because Congress will never approve those kind of tariff increases. And what is the truth, unfortunately, is that they don't have to. I checked that in the fall. I did a course with Davidson Learns, and I checked on that with both Dennis Appleyard, who's international trade specialist, and it was very interesting because Dennis said, well, yes, that's a possibility. I don't remember them ever doing it. Then he looked more carefully, and then Susan, you gave me that article about tariffs, and it was very clear in there that national emergencies could be used as a justification for tariff increases. It's just we haven't used it. But again, I would not put it by Trump to use it. And with a Republican Senate and House of Representatives, he can probably get away with it. Does that answer the?
What would a national emergency look like?
Well, a national emergency, for instance, could be if we were having a very serious conflict with China and we did not want to buy their solar panels. And so we put on a very prohibitive tariff on solar panels from China. So it generally would have to be, I think, specific to a country and a product. But that's not what he's talking about. He's just talking about declaring almost the equivalent of a national economic emergency, which again, doesn't have a lot of sense behind it. But I think what we have to realize is, and again, I'm not trying to be just negative on Trump, that Trump gets away with a lot of stuff without appropriate and honest justification. And that's one of the more serious concerns today, is that he doesn't have a divided Congress to counter him. He basically has small majorities in the House of Representatives and the Senate. And if they vote exclusively Republican, he can get away with a lot of things that are not accurate and would, under normal circumstances, not be approved.
At the end of the Clinton administration, there's lots of talk about what we should do with the emerging government surplus. I was curious, what were we doing then to make a surplus that we aren't doing now? Could we return some of the same forces to be moving in the right direction again?
Sorry, my hearing aids weren't working terribly well. John, could you repeat the question?
I was curious about the end of the Clinton administration when we were running a surplus and there were talk about paying off the entire national debt and retiring federal some of the debt that we had. What kind of forces were involved then that aren't involved now? Could we re-stimulate some of those old forces and get things moving in the right direction again? Could you hear me on that?
Not so well, did you?
Let me try on this one.
Yeah.
The question is, at the end of the Clinton administration, there was a surplus rather than a deficit. And the questioner is asking, what were we doing then, or what were the practices then that resulted in a surplus? And could we revisit those and replicate them today in order to deal with the debt?
Right. The Clinton administration surplus was a pretty unique thing. It first off, it started with a much lower deficit, but secondly, it culminated with a strong agreement between Democrats and Republicans to have a balanced budget. The Democrats, the Democrats conceded on reducing some of the tax reductions of the Bush years. So the Democrats agreed to having reductions of the budget deficits, of the taxes, which would raise revenues. The principal thing that the Republicans conceded on, and the Democrats also conceded on, was the strong reduction in welfare payments and the limiting on welfare. To this day, a large number of very liberal Democrats do not like the Clintons and do not like the Clintons because of the response that they had on limiting welfare payments. So it was principally a very strong agreement on tax changes and on welfare issues that led to more revenue and less expenditure and a surplus. But as I said, it was in some ways very principled, and it was a clear agreement, but it was something that hurt, for better or for worse, high income people, but it also very much hurt those on welfare and strongly limited our transfer of resources to low income individuals. So that's a very good question. I don't see a likelihood with a 6% deficit of finding any kind of agreement like that with the Congress today. But it's a very good question to ask since that did happen.
Let's all thank Clark, and then I have two announcements. Thank you. Our speaker next week will be Leah Newman and Elizabeth Bradford. Leah is the director and curator of the Van Every Smith Galleries, and Elizabeth is a renowned Davidson artist, best known for her large-scale paintings of landscapes. And the second announcement, Margot asked me to remind people that on Saturday at 2 o'clock, Dark Waters movie will be shown. And this is about the forever chemicals in water and soil that are causing cancer and developmental issues with children. Clark, thank you again.